letter that we received from Eric Stiles, the president of New Jersey Audubon, but I think just for the record, I would like to read the letter to you. Dear Sandy, on behalf of New Jersey Audubon, I am sending our best wishes and congratulations to the Montclair Bird Club on the occasion of its 100th anniversary. Sustaining such an esteemed and important environmental organization for a century is an outstanding achievement for which your membership should be very proud. Great ornithologists and naturalists from Montclair Bird Club, such as Warren Eaton and Lee Edwards, have made significant contributions to the natural history of New Jersey. There's been a long-standing and valued relationship between our two organizations. Several former presidents of the Montclair Bird Club have served with distinction as president and board chair of New Jersey Audubon, and other club members have served as officers, committee members, volunteers, and supporters. New Jersey Audubon remains grateful for the 1959 gift from Montclair Bird Club of the Montclair Hawk Lookout and the many years of volunteer service there by Eric Bahoon Jr., Elsa Greenstone, Wayne Greenstone, and other NBC members for their leadership in monitoring migration and their contributions to raptor conservation and environmental education. Congratulations once more and best wishes for the future of the Montclair Bird Club and the strengthening of the bonds between NBC and the New Jersey Audubon as we face the conservation challenges of the next century. And that is signed by Eric Stiles, President and CEO of New Jersey Audubon Society. So thank you very, very much, and I think people here deserve that. Donna, if you're ready to do the introductions, there are two boards up, a yellow one up here and a red one up here. And the yellow one contains some good information, but it also has the highlights of meetings that took place between 1920 and 1955. If you read nothing else, read about 1938. It was an amazing year. Up here you see the newspaper articles that started back towards the beginning of the last century. So Donna, here it is.
I think I'm a little too short to be at the podium there. Thank you, Sandy. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker. Rick Wright is native of Southeast Nebraska, studied French, German, philosophy, and life sciences at the University of Nebraska, where he worked in the ornithology collections at the State Museum and served as teaching assistant to Paul Jonesgard. In 1985, he was a founding member of the Nebraska Ornithologists Union Bird Records Committee. After a detour to Harvard Law School, Rick took the MA and PhD in German at Princeton University. His years as an academic included appointments as assistant professor of German at the University of Illinois, reader scholar at Princeton University's Index of Christian Art, and associate professor of medieval studies at Fordham University. Through it all, Rick kept on birding Europe and the Americas. Rick combines his interests and experiences in lectures, books, and articles about birds and the way we think about them. Now leader at Victor Emmanuel Nature Tours, he conducts a full program of birds and art tours across Europe where nature and culture and history all come together. Among his scholarly publications are two books on the Latin and German animal literature of the late Middle Ages. He's also the author of the American Birding Association's Field Guides to Arizona and New Jersey, and of the Peterson Reference Guide to North American Sparrows. A prolific contributor to the birding literature and sought-after lecturer, Rick lives with his wife Allison Berenger and their chocolate lab Gelmer in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Rick has been a member of the Montclair Bird Club for about 8 years now and has contributed in a very positive way to our club through leading multiple field trips each season and providing numerous lectures through the years. We are privileged to have him as our presenter for our 100th anniversary celebration dinner. May I introduce Rick Wright, presenting Haven, New Jersey.
It's been more than 65 years now, but I still can't forgive Roger Torrey Peterson. In 1953, Peterson took his friend and much more famous colleague James Fisher on a 30,000-mile, year-long birding trip around North America, from Newfoundland to Florida to Mexico to California to Alaska. But he didn't take the time to stop to show Fisher a single bird in New Jersey. Peterson had spent considerable time birding the Garden State in the 1930s and 40s, when golden plovers still rested on the runways of Newark Airport and Henslow sparrows still sang from the weedy fields of central New Jersey. By the early 1950s, though, he and many of his contemporaries were writing New Jersey off from the birder's point of view, its best and wildest habitats replaced, in Peterson's words, by flimsy beach houses and hot dog stands. He and Fisher drove down the Jersey shore on their way from New York to Washington, but they passed right by all the famous sights that make our state the bird-watching playground of the mid-Atlantic. Happily, some of the areas whose passing Peterson lamented are back on the birder's mental map. Brigantine, Thank you. Brigantine, Barnegat, Island Beach, all are in better shape today than they were in the mid-1950s. Not pristine by any means, but the last half century has seen the return of American oyster catchers, piping plovers, black skimmers, and least terns to beaches that Peterson and many of the birders of his day had given up as lost for good. No one can predict the future, but it may, one hopes, turn out that the mid-20th century gloom was just a blip, just an episode in New Jersey's enduring history of birding excellence. And a long history it is, reaching from the 18th century to the present day. There is no good comprehensive review of our state's birding and ornithological history, but it's clear that thanks to its diversity of habitats and a position smack dab in the middle of the most densely populated portion of the continent, that those of us interested in the feathered has always given this long peninsula particular attention. That attention is reflected most strikingly in the proportionally large number of birds discovered, described, or named from New Jersey. That formulation, discovered, described, or named, is a bit coy. But it's worth keeping in mind that those events have not always been simultaneous, especially in those first decades after Linnaeus formulated the binomial system of scientific naming still in use today. A fine example of the complexity of early ornithology and its unraveling is provided by a bird that migrates through and breeds in New Jersey, the fire-throated little black and white warbler we know as the Blackburnian. The first specimens of this little beauty to reach England were collected, that is to say, were shot, in the late 1770s, right here in New Jersey. Those precious skins were shipped to a learned lady in England, who in turn made them available to her naturalist colleague Thomas Pennant. In 1788, the new species was formally named for this Anna Blackburn, and that should have been that. But the new species wasn't really new. More than a decade earlier, the Royal Museum in Paris had received skins of a bird that was helpfully named the foreign warbler. Those specimens came from northern South America, and when French natural historians described the little bird, they assumed that it bred, rather than just wintered, in Guyana. Here, though, is the complication. For the better part of a century, the French steadfastly resisted the Linnaean method of naming animals, and so the museum staff in Paris kept calling it the foreign warbler, declining to give it a proper scientific name. That was finally remedied in 1776 by a German who christened the French scientist bird Fusca in scientific Latin. Because the German got around to it before the French did and before Pennant did, the scientific name Blackburnii of Blackburn is invalid. And this glorious fiery-breasted sprite of the springtime treetops is today officially known to ornithologists as Setophaga fusca, the brown moth-eater. That's unfortunate enough. But what is truly sad is that that scientific name entirely conceals the bird's New Jersey connection. Anna Blackburn's brother, Ashton, was the fifth son of a large family, and it's no surprise that he left Lancashire to seek his fortune abroad. He settled near New York and spent most of his time collecting birds for his sister's collection. Unfortunately, the exact localities of many of the specimens he sent home are unknown. Anna tended to note only that Ashton had sent the specimens from New York, reflecting the postmark of the shipments rather than their geographic origins. We know, however, that Ashton Blackburn collected extensively in northern and central New Jersey. Over the decades he spent in America, he shipped more than 100 species of birds back to England, and no fewer than 16 of them were entirely new to Western science. Among them, the clapper rail, the red-shouldered hawk, the Labrador duck, and the wood thrush. But Ashton Blackburn's contributions are elided in the scientific record because though he discovered the birds, he neither gave them proper scientific names nor were any named for him. And just as his link to those species is largely forgotten, so is the fact that many of them, probably even most of them, were first discovered and collected right here in New Jersey. We're on somewhat surer ground, historically and geographically, a generation later, with the arrival of Alexander Wilson on these shores in the summer of 1794. In his native Paisley, Scotland, Wilson had been a weaver, a poet of minor reputation, and most significantly, a failed extortionist. That last activity was the prompt he needed to leave home for the New World. Wilson did live in northern New Jersey, in Bloomfield, for half a year in 1802. He hated it, and for most of his 19 years in the United States, he resided in Philadelphia. But the years of work on his great handbook of American birds brought him again and again to the marshes of New Jersey, where he made most of the discoveries that would justify the title given to him after his death at the age of 47, Father of American Ornithology. Those trips to Great Egg and to Cape May were not without their perils, and Wilson, single-minded to the point of rashness, nearly lost his life on one of them. Near present-day Stone Harbor, Wilson shot an oyster catcher, planning to use it as the model for an illustration in his book. Wilson's aim was bad that day, though, and he merely winged the bird, which took off to the east and landed on the water. Wilson plunged in after it, wearing his heavy hunting clothes and carrying his gun, and found himself in a riptide. He nearly drowned, and the harrowing experience did not improve his already tenuous health. It doesn't take much imagination to think of the oyster catchers luring Wilson out to sea as a bit of shorebird revenge. Wilson collected many specimens from that group on the New Jersey coast, some of them new to science. One species that he found here seems especially poignant now. Out in the salt marshes, Wilson shot long-billed curlews in both spring and fall. He was certain that he had discovered a new species and that he was the first to distinguish this bird from the somewhat similar European curlew. But he'd been scooped just a few months earlier by another German ornithologist who had already formally named the species from specimens collected in New York. Today, of course, long-billed curlews are among the rarest of the rare in eastern North America, scarce now even in Florida in winter, and almost, but not quite, unheard of in the mid-Atlantic region. If Wilson mistook the curlew for something entirely new, he made the opposite error one July day at Summers Point, where he shot a number of small plovers on the beach. He noticed that they were unusually pale above, he said, inclining to ashy white, and concluded that this must be the grayish summer plumage of the common ringed plover of Europe. Wilson observed that southbound birds in the summer were much darker, much browner above, and must be in the winter plumage. The two plumages, of course, were two entirely different species. And Wilson had, in fact, discovered the Atlantic piping plover. To his great credit, and characteristically, he would go on to correct his error in a later volume of the American Ornithology. Subsequent observation had proved that both the dark birds, which were semi-palmated plovers, and the pale birds, which were piping plovers, arrived in New Jersey at the same time in spring, but the dark birds, semi-palmated plovers, continued north in May, leaving only pale birds, piping plovers, to breed on the sandy beaches. The dark birds reappear in September and stay in New Jersey then for fully a month after the light ones have disappeared to the south. But what convinced Wilson that the two were distinct species was the voice, a sharp twittering given by the dark birds, while the pale birds, piping plovers, have, he wrote, a peculiarly soft and musical note similar to the tone of a German flute. They could not be the same. The presence of a piping plover on the dust jacket of the ABA Field Guide is tribute to Wilson's persistence in working this puzzle out, and perhaps too subtle a reminder that this species has been a New Jersey bird in a very special way from the very start. Wilson was also the discoverer and namer of the fish crow. It's surprising that so common and so conspicuous a bird should have had to wait until the early 19th century to be described to science. Wilson says that he first became aware of the species in coastal Georgia, where the distinctively odd croaking voice first attracted his attention. He did not describe and name the species, however, until 1812, when he located an active nest at Great Egg Harbor. Wilson shot the male of the pair, and it is his painting of that bird that provides the type of the species, the original specimen to which the scientific name is formally attached. Wilson's bird from Great Egg Harbor, this bird, is the fish crow. New Jersey also provided Wilson with the type specimens of smaller passerines. Though he also records finding grasshopper sparrows on Staten Island, he based his formal description of the species on the numerous specimens he collected in New Jersey. His first seaside sparrows, which were the first seaside sparrows known to science, came from Great Egg as well. Wilson collected large numbers of that common salt marsh bird in the attempt to determine its diet. He also ate at least one seaside sparrow himself, finding that the flesh had a sedgy taste. One could have predicted that. More mysterious are the circumstances of Wilson's discovery of the Savannah sparrow, which he named as a new species in his American Ornithology. It has been argued that the first specimens he handled were taken in New Jersey. A close reading of his published account, though, a close reading against his travel itineraries between 1809 and 1811, makes it almost certain that the type locality for this would-be new species should be considered Georgia. And so we lose a bird from the list of New Jersey discoveries. Or do we? The Ipswich sparrow, now generally tallied as a distinctive subspecies of the savanna, breeds only on Nova Scotia's Cape Sable Island. This is an uncommon winter resident of the grassy dunes on New Jersey's barrier beaches, where a good look at this frosty beauty is always the highlight of a chilly day's walk. The history of how scientific ornithology dealt with the discovery and classification of the Ipswich sparrow beginning in the 1860s is convoluted and complex, involving vanity, betrayal, lost specimens, and a great deal of wishful thinking. What is of interest to us in our context is the fact that half a century before C.J. Maynard and Spencer Baird had their falling out over this bird, Wilson collected, described, drew, and published a sparrow he had collected at Great Egg Harbor. On dissection, Wilson's bird proved to be a male, and Wilson assumed that the normal savanna sparrow showed marked sexual difference in size and plumage, such that the males were much larger and much paler than females. He was wrong, of course, and what he had actually shot and painted was an Ipswich sparrow, a bird that would not be recognized as distinct for some 60 years after Wilson's death. Had he known, it would have been another feather in New Jersey's ornithological cap. Most of Wilson's explorations of New Jersey were conducted in the last 3 years of his life, after he'd made the acquaintance of George Ord. Ord, the scion of a wealthy Philadelphia rope manufacturing family, found in Wilson a mentor in natural history. It was Ord who honored Wilson with the title Father of American Ornithology, and it was Ord who saw the last volumes of Wilson's great work through the press after their author's death. He accompanied Wilson on collecting expeditions to New Jersey several times, and one can safely assume that he bankrolled those trips, at least in part, increasing his own commitment to seeing the American Ornithology completed after Wilson died in 1813. The first monument Ord erected to his regretted friend was, naturally, a bird. 3 months before Wilson succumbed to dysentery in Philadelphia, the two visited the shores of Cape May, north to Great Egg Harbor. On May 13th, they collected 3 specimens of what Wilson called a neat and prettily marked species neither had seen before. Wilson died before he could prepare a formal description of the new species. Ord, as literary executor, took it upon himself to name the bird Wilson's plover, Charadrius wilsonius. He later conferred with local hunters who all claimed to know the bird. But Ord was convinced, rightly convinced, that the species was rare, though the specimens he and Wilson had shot showed signs of breeding. Like the long-billed curlew, the Wilson's plover is now a prime rarity in New Jersey. Unlike the long-billed curlew, however, its population and range are probably increasing. And in recent years, the species has been a more or less annual visitor to South Jersey. We will see Wilson's plover return to New Jersey as a nesting bird. Wilson is also associated with 2 of the nicer American wood warblers, the Cape May warbler and, obviously, the Wilson's warbler. Both of those birds have a strong New Jersey connection. It is repeatedly claimed in birding circles that Wilson discovered the Wilson's warbler and promptly named it for himself. That is a slander and a lie. The sort of thing one can say only if one is too lazy to look beyond the current names of things. Wilson did indeed collect the first specimen of the species somewhere in southern New Jersey, and he was the first to publish a detailed diagnosis in a picture, but he did not name it for himself. Wilson was a descriptive namer, and he took advantage of his prerogative to focus on 2 different characteristics in the English and in the scientific names he assigned. In scientific Latin, he named it Pusilla, little, as this is indeed a small bird. And in English, he called it straightforwardly, if verbosely, the black-capped green flycatcher. Those names were still in use well after Wilson's death. Not until 1828, when Wilson had lain a moldering in Philadelphia for 15 years, was the scientific name changed to Wilsonii, making it inevitable that the English name would follow suit. The scientific names, as scientific names are wont to do, have gone back and forth several times, but we still use the English epithet Wilson's for this bird. And we need to see it as a memorial to the ornithologist's attainments, not as a marker of any immodesty. The Cape May warbler's name should be more straightforward, but the story of its connection to Wilson is at least as complex. The standard line among today's birders is that Wilson discovered the species at Cape May. In fact, however, though Wilson didn't know it at the time, this bird had already been described and named 6 times. Moreover, the Cape May discovery wasn't even Wilson's. He makes clear in the American Ornithology that it was Ord who collected the elegant little stranger in a maple swamp, and that if it had been up to Wilson, the bird would never have been detected. The little corpse was the only representative of this species that Wilson would ever see in his life. The name Cape May warbler persisted, however, probably because the older alternatives were so dull. Spotted yellow warbler, the name originally used by European ornithologists, doesn't capture the bright beauty of this bird. The claim that Wilson was the discoverer of this warbler can be put down to mere historical sloppiness. But it gained real piquancy and real staying power in June of 1977, when Britain got its first record of the Cape May warbler. That misplaced bird landed, of all places, in Paisley, Scotland, the hometown of Alexander Wilson. And no journalist could resist the temptation to make the link between the man and the bird even tighter than it historically was. The story just would not have had the same zing had it been told and retold accurately. George Ord survived his friend by more than 50 years, and he devoted most of the rest of his life to natural historical pursuits, including the discovery and the description of new birds. 2 of them are of special interest to us New Jersey birders, and both raise a bit of a mystery. In 1815, Ord published his description of a bird he called the banded-tailed tern. The specimen is lost, but the description is clearly that of a small gull and not a tern at all. It seems surprising that Ord, of all people, would have confused these 2 quite different groups, and I wonder whether the name and description were not mismatched by the printer. In any event, the description, short as it is good enough to make us certain that the white bird Ord shot was what we now know as the Bonaparte's gull. and the species name of his banded-tailed tern, Philadelphia, is now applied to that common small gull. The type locality where Ord collected the specimen whose description he published is not known with precision, but it may well have been on the New Jersey side of the Delaware. More bizarre and potentially more troubling is Ord's tooth-billed gull. On the same page as his band-tailed tern, Ord described a beautiful gull discovered on the Delaware below Philadelphia, again with no indication of whether on the left or right bank. The strange part of the description is that responsible for the weird name tooth-billed. He wrote, "The upper mandible has 4 indentations or blunt teeth. The lower has 3. The rest of the description could easily apply to any medium-sized white-headed gull." Meanwhile, in 1831, another new gull was described from Hudson Bay and given the English name ring-billed gull. The two nominal species, the ring-billed and the tooth-billed, coexisted until 1848, when a museum worker decided that the two must be identical, and that Ord's bird had simply, if dramatically, been deformed. Chronological priority rules in scientific naming, and Ord's description had appeared in print 16 years before the Hudson Bay account. As a result, it is Ord's scientific name that is officially valid today, Delawarensis, and that is, and always will be, the scientific name of the ring-billed gull. Had I been around in 1858, I would have protested vigorously. Except for the bit about the odd toothing of the bill, Ord's description is not very eloquent and can easily be stretched to take in any number of other mid-sized gulls with ashy gray upper parts. Richardson's species account from Arctic Canada, in contrast, is thorough and definitive, leaving no doubt as to what he was attempting to describe. I would be happy to see Ord's name Delawarensis thrown out entirely, even if it would mean the loss of a New Jersey connection, and Richardson's name, Zonorhynchus, reinstated. Zonorhynchus means ring-billed. But let me step down from that high horse to return to this bird, Bonaparte's gull, or rather to the man whose memory that name honors. Charles Lucien Bonaparte was the eldest nephew of Napoleon. He was born when his imperial uncle was still childless, and he would have been next in line to the throne had Napoleon not disinherited him on the tiny little technicality that Charles Lucien's parents were not married at the time of his birth. Instead of becoming emperor, Charles Lucien took up the study of natural history, and he made his first great discovery at the age of 14 when he collected the first known specimen of the mustached warbler in Italy. Charlie Bonaparte was willing to pull his dynastic weight, and he dutifully married his cousin Zenaide. The couple then followed Zenaide's father, Charles Lucien's uncle Joseph, the erstwhile king of Spain, into exile in Bordentown, New Jersey, where Charles Bonaparte found rich new fields for his ornithological investigations. In mid-July of 1826, Bonaparte took a collecting trip to the Jersey shore. At Long Branch, he came across a flock of very remarkable sandpipers, one of which he was able to shoot and, of course, name. The new bird seemed to link the curlews and the willets. It exhibited both a down-curved bill and conspicuous, though partial, webbing to the toes. The shooters of the New Jersey and Long Island coast discerned another similarity in the bird's up-and-down, probing, feeding habit. They called it the bastard dowitcher, and we call it the stilt sandpiper, the first new species discovered by Charlie Bonaparte in New Jersey. The other was found closer to home, when Bonaparte shot 2 large bird hawks within a few weeks near his father-in-law and uncle's estate at Bordentown. A short while later, Bonaparte's friend William Cooper sent him the measurements and description of another bird hawk from Long Island. Bonaparte immediately saw that this bird was different from the then common sharp-shinned hawk, and confidently and incorrectly predicted that even the most superficial observer would have no trouble telling them apart. He named the hawk for Cooper. Long thought of as uncommon to rare over most of the East, the Cooper's hawk is now by far the most abundant of the 3 accipiter species nesting in New Jersey, and it gives us ample opportunity to think of Charles Bonaparte each time one visits the bird feeder. Between Wilson, Ord, and Bonaparte, There wasn't much left over by the time John James Audubon began to spend his time birding New Jersey. Even the fork-tailed flycatcher, which Audubon collected twice in the state, had already been shot at Bridgetown and shipped to Philadelphia for display. But Audubon did add one bird to the world's avifauna from New Jersey, a bird that has never been seen here, or for that matter, in the Northern Hemisphere ever since. In 1838, Audubon published a brief text to accompany plate number 409 of his Birds of America. James Trudeau was a Louisiana physician who had occasionally joined Audubon in the field. Sometime before 1838, Trudeau, visiting New Jersey, shot a tern he didn't recognize at Great Egg Harbor. He presented the specimen to Audubon. Audubon knew immediately that this bird was new to science, and he named it for his friend, Trudeau's tern. Today, it's officially known as the snowy crowned tern. Audubon knew nothing of the bird's normal range, but we know today that the snowy crowned tern is restricted to southern South America. The only records of vagrancy pertain to a few birds found on the Falkland Islands. For a century and a half, Audubon's account of Trudeau's specimen was accepted as the only record of the species ever from North America. The latest edition of the American Ornithologists Union checklist, however, removed it to the appendix, placing it among other species reported with insufficient evidence for placement on the main list. The insinuation is that Trudeau was mistaken about where the specimen had come from. It's not the least bit unusual for a record to be reevaluated and found somehow wanting. But in this case, the result is bizarre. Because Audubon was the first to describe the species, its type locality, the geographic origin of the first specimen, is Great Egg Harbor, New Jersey. But the species is not on the official list of the birds of North America. I don't know of a parallel circumstance anywhere in the history of ornithological nomenclature. One more story of a similar puzzler. The Atlantic brant is a familiar winter bird on the New Jersey coast. In January 1848, the New York ornithologist George Newbold Lawrence received an unusual specimen of brant from Great Egg Harbor. Two more were sent to him shortly thereafter. These birds resembled our common brant, but the white neck patch was more extensive, and the belly, dull pale gray in the Atlantic brant, was dark blackish brown, showing only little contrast with the black of the breast. Lawrence described it as a new species, the black brant, and soon learned that the hunters of the Back Bays were familiar with these dark geese, though even they considered them rare. The black brant has had its taxonomic ups and downs over the years and is currently, probably incorrectly, considered just a subspecies of a circumpolar brant species. What is strange is that this subspecies, widely and abundantly found everywhere on the shores of the Pacific, should have had to wait until the middle of the 19th century to be noticed by science, and that notice should have been taken in New Jersey. It's been suggested that the specimens Lawrence was sent were not real black brant, but an unknown darkish variant of the Atlantic brant. But there's no reason to assume that there was any error, particularly as genuine black brant are now known to occur in our state almost every winter. Very small numbers, perhaps a family group or two, joining the Atlantic brant on sod banks, ocean inlets, and soccer fields. Besides, Lawrence was the describer of the species. By definition, the black brant is exactly what he said it was and nothing else. I hope that I've provided a hint of just how much ornithological history can be extracted from the first descriptions of birds from New Jersey. There's a great deal yet to be done, though. There's virtually nothing known of the ornithological activities of Hessian scientists in New Jersey during the Revolutionary War. We know that several were actively out collecting botanical specimens, and the fox sparrow, the red fox sparrow, was described from a specimen taken by a Hessian mercenary. There is also, I hope, more to be discovered about Ashton Blackburn and his movements. Surely details lurk in his sister's papers that would cast more light on early natural history pursuits in New Jersey. And the greatest mystery man of them all. The French ornithologist Louis-Pierre Vieillot lived in New York and New Jersey in the early 1790s. and it was here that he conducted most of the field work for his 4-volume Natural History of the Birds of North America. Only 2 volumes of the 4 ever appeared in print, unfortunately. If you find time lying heavy on your hands, consider dedicating yourself to the search for those remaining 2 volumes and any information that still survives about his travels in America, the specimens he collected, and the colleagues he consulted. Even the smallest discovery will add something new. And something new is exactly what we're after when we spend our time looking at things old, like the first descriptions of birds from New Jersey. Thank you.